An interactive steampunk fantasy-themed detective novel is a pretty interesting concept for a live service game, but that's exactly what Silver Palace is. You play as a master detective, solving mysteries in the steampunk fantasy city of Silvernia with the assistance of a colorful cast of characters inspired by famous literary works. Now, I've just finished playing through the second closed beta test for Silver Palace, and I think I have a pretty good handle on what the game is gonna be like now, and that means it's time to share my opinion on the whole game. But because my channel focuses mostly on lore and storytelling, my thoughts are mostly going to be centered on the game's story. I will still talk about some other aspects of the game like the combat, exploration, and side content, but I won't spend as much time on it. Also, full disclosure before we begin, this video is sponsored by Silver Palace, but please note that that fact has no impact on the opinions that I will present in this video. You deserve nothing less than my unfiltered and honest thoughts, so that's what you're gonna get. And with all that preamble out of the way, I did say I wanted to focus on the storytelling of Silver Palace, so that's where we're gonna start. A mystery game lives and dies by the quality of its writing, so when playing Silver Palace, the story was what I focused on first and foremost. This was something I wasn't able to get a good feel for during the first beta because there just wasn't much of the main story available. But the second beta has, by my estimate, at least 3 times the amount of story, so I definitely think I have a better feel for things now. And honestly, I'm feeling pretty good about the story right now. The brand new introductory sequence does a great job of setting expectations for the rest of the game. It starts with a very short narrator monologue segment, where you get to pick which of the 2 detective siblings you want to play as for the rest of the game. And then you're immediately thrown right into the main story where the detective siblings board a super cool airship shaped like a whale with fingers in order to receive a commendation award from the current queen. You know, for all their detective work. This reward takes the form of a reactor, a special device that's capable of controlling a magical substance called Silverium. Silverium powers everything in this game. It's a source of electricity, magic, and a whole host of other things. But despite being the heart of the game's magic system, we don't get to learn much more about it during the beta. But it's still something you should know about. Anyway, this is a detective game, so of course the siblings immediately uncover a plot to assassinate the queen, which they easily put a stop to in true master detective fashion. But things take a nasty turn when a second group of antagonists show up and somehow use Silverium to turn people on board the airship into silver zombies, while also summoning a bizarre Dark Souls-esque entity that you have to fight in one of the coolest introductory boss fights I've seen in ages. And as the burning airship falls out of the sky, your sibling ends up taking a bullet to the face for you, and nearly everyone on board the ship falls to their death, including your sibling and the queen. As one of the few survivors, you, the detective, are blamed for the death of the queen but never formally charged with her assassination. Regardless, the detective decides to leave the capital city of Silvernia while they try and track down their sibling's murderer. 3 years later, they return to Silvernia after receiving a letter of invitation from a former acquaintance in law enforcement, Lauren. He wants your help to solve a, let's call it a homicidal arsonist case. But working on an official investigation in a formal capacity requires the detective to hire a new partner to work alongside them in place of their deceased sibling. So the detective hires Ashley, a clever and well-educated young lady from Silvernia's most economically depressed district. But despite her lack of funding, Ashley does not ask for any payment for her work, only for the detective to solve her riddle for reasons that she refuses to explain. But it doesn't take long for the detective to realize that this homicidal arsonist case is not only connected to Ashley's past, but also to the organization that killed their sibling. And that is the premise for the very first main mystery of the game. Now, admittedly, the mystery itself might be a bit straightforward and arguably too easy for a detective game, but I think it's fine for the first big mystery to be simple and easy. I mean, you gotta start somewhere, and mysteries can always get more complicated later on. Now, I actually quite enjoyed the story, and it made me pretty optimistic about what kind of stories we're gonna see in the future. But I can't really elaborate on those thoughts without spoiling big parts of the story, and I don't really want to do that. So, here's some thoughts on the overall execution of it, just so you have an idea of what to expect. Now, if you were expecting branching dialogue options, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Picking different dialogue options doesn't really change anything in the plot, but it does give you some different responses, which kind of sucks, but 2 things to note here. First, this is a detective game, and detective games are kind of based on the premise of collecting as much information as possible. And branching dialogue options gives you the choice of what kind of information you're going for, so I think in that context, it's actually fine here. And second, I think it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do branching dialogue options with real consequences in a live service game, especially in the main story. At this point, I kind of feel like we all just have to sort of make peace with this reality. Now, speaking of dialogue, it's actually pretty good. I wouldn't regard it as like a masterful execution of wordplay and wit, but it's fluid, it's era appropriate, it's not awkward, and it's definitely not bloated. And that last one is a huge one for me. Too much padding in dialogue is a source of immense frustration for me, so I am very grateful that it is not present in this game. The dialogue is also written with a lot of British flair, and the voice acting really sells it with a wide range of accents that the voice actors are allowed to use. And I gotta say, I was really surprised at how much of this game is voice acted. I felt like there was voice acting in almost everything except for like really minor quests like dailies and NPC encounters. That was a lovely surprise, as is the fact that the main character actually talks a lot. They have full-voiced conversations with the other characters in the game, and they have a sort of inner monologue. They're also not an amnesiac for once. It definitely makes them feel like their own character more than a self-insert, and I greatly appreciate that. Now, apart from the dialogue, which is pretty solid, there are some weird things in the overall writing that may or may not be the result of an odd localization. For example, at one point in the main story, this is like a very minor spoiler, the detective has to break into the police station in order to take back the burned body that the police seized from the crime scene. Logistics of secretly stealing a dead body in police custody aside, dead bodies are typically stored in morgues, not in tiny mini fridge-sized safes in an evidence room. So this was a very confusing sequence despite the stealth segments being kinda neat. I don't know how you fit a whole body in there, and also, why is a body in the evidence room? Also, where did we put the body when we left the station? I don't think it fits in our pocket. But the reason I think this might be a localization issue is because later on, the game tells us that only a charred hand and some photographs of the body were left behind. But I still don't believe that a hand from a victim would ever be stored in a police safe in the evidence room. That would be really strange. But despite how befuddled this segment left me, weird inconsistencies like this are actually pretty rare in the main story. This is definitely the biggest offender in the entire quest, and arguably the only one that matters. So it's not that bad, but it still bugs me. Now, on a more positive note, the writers have done a great job making the story very character-focused, and I like that. Ashley isn't just a sidekick or a potential suspect in the investigation, she's the cornerstone of the entire mystery, and she gets some really nice slow burn character development throughout the entire quest. But she's not an exception, you know? There's no character that shows up in the story that feels like an afterthought. Even the bartender, who has like 2 lines, doesn't feel wasted simply because he's a bartender doing bartender things. He's not out here sharing his life story or flirting needlessly with the detective. He's doing his job and fulfilling his role within the world itself. So his presence is believable. So even though he only shows up for under a minute, he still feels like he fits in. And to be honest, this might even just be foreshadowing for future quests. Bars and taverns are great places to gather information, after all, and this is a very natural way of introducing a potential future contact. And that sense of foreshadowing is everywhere in the game. Factions, companies, name drops, current events mentioned in passing on the streets. While these things may not be super relevant to the current quest, they are definitely hinting at future connections to future cases, which will likely tie back to this one. And I say that because I already see signs of it, and it makes me very happy. But on the foreshadowing note, one big concern I did have about Silver Palace had to do with it being a gacha game and a mystery game, because those two don't usually go together very well. Gacha games need the featured characters to be sellable, and if the featured character has like a mysterious identity relevant to the plot, then there's a big chance that their playable version will spoil the plot twists, you know? For example, Ashley is quite obviously based on the story of Cinderella, and it just so happens that a character named Cinderella/Ashley Ashley is featured on the limited banner. And Cinderella Ashley looks real different from the Ashley we know, so the existence of this character feels like it's spoiling the story, which I generally do not like. But fortunately, Ashley's identity isn't actually the big twist here. It's definitely a twist, but it's more of a twist for the detective, not the player. For the player, this identity swap is actually a bit of a red herring. It makes you think that the story is going in one direction when it's actually going in a very different direction that I am definitely not going to elaborate on because that would ruin the surprise. That said, I'm very pleased to see that the developers are very aware of this potential spoilery problem and have taken some creative measures to work around it. It's not a perfect system, but it's not bad either. Before we move on, I do want to mention that the story itself is not just told via cutscenes, dialogue options, and running around the map. There are two noteworthy gameplay mechanics that are related to solving mysteries, which I really like conceptually, but I think both of them are currently a bit undercooked. The first is this observation mechanic where you look at a character's model to spot details that tell you more about them. This just isn't a very satisfying mechanic because everything is perfectly highlighted for you, so it feels less like deduction and more like a word search, but like a word search for children. It's just not a very fun or interesting system. But I can also extend this feeling of dissatisfaction towards the investigation of crime scenes as well, because it's basically the exact same system, just within an environment instead of, on a character's model. It just doesn't feel like we're doing any real detective work. Now, the second mechanic is the evidence board, which keeps track of all the clues you've found and your progression through the cases. Now, I love this idea in concept, and the art in here is also fantastic. But again, it has that same problem where there's just not enough being asked of the player. It's not engaging the brain, Like there's always the same amount of available clues as there are slots to place the clues in. Now, as a case tracker, this is more or less sufficient. But as a tool for encouraging the player to actually work through the details of the case for themselves, it falls quite short. I do hope they refine this system further because it's really cool in concept and I think it could be really fun, but we just need it to be less handholdy and more of a puzzle. But overall, I gotta say, I've actually been pretty pleased with the main story, and I'm pretty optimistic about future developments. But I literally cannot say anything else without spoiling things, so let's move on to the next aspect of the game, combat. Now, my disclaimer here is that I am definitely not the person to ask for a deep analysis on a game's combat system. There are a lot of people out there who are way better equipped to do that than me, so rather than going into the specifics of how the combat works and character skills, equipment, and classes, etc., I'm just gonna tell you what it feels like to play. But before I do, I want to preface what I'm about to say by pointing out something interesting that Silver Palace has done that I haven't really seen that many other live service games do. When you first load the game will actually ask you whether or not you want to play on classic mode or story mode. Classic mode has the quote intended combat experience, while story mode has a lower difficulty and reduced enemy encounters, so players who just want to experience the story can do so without getting soft-locked by a boss they can't beat. Now, I did play on classic mode for the second beta, and I didn't really find it particularly challenging, but I know for sure that the way the combat in this game is structured, it's definitely gonna trip up some people who just want to play for the story, and also the side content. Now, the fact you can swap between these two modes and that the modes exist at all means the developer understands this situation very well. So if you're someone who kind of struggles with reactive combat, which is the type of combat that Silver Palace offers, don't let that dissuade you from actually picking up the game. On the surface, combat is pretty straightforward. You have a basic attack, sometimes you have a charge attack, you have a skill, and you have an ultimate. And sometimes you have the ability to combo between these. This is a very familiar setup to anyone who's played some of the more recent popular 3D live service games, so there really shouldn't be any surprises here, but it becomes clear pretty quickly that the combat system of this game was optimized for boss fights rather than mobs. See, all attacks in this game can either be parried or dodged, and you'll mostly end up wanting to parry since you can avoid damage while dealing damage at the same time. And the timing for a successful parry is very forgiving in this game. So forgiving, in fact, that you can just kind of spam the parry button and become invincible to any attack while dealing damage, with the exception of a few attacks that you have to dodge instead. Now look, I am all for forgiving parry windows, but combat feels really boring once you figure out you can parry cheese your way through basically everything. So something's definitely gotta change there. Without spamming the parry button though, boss boss fights can be super fun because they're very interactive. You don't really cycle swap between your character's skill and ultimate like so many other games of this genre, because so much of the fight relies on your reactions and ability to read the enemy's movements. And that give and take nature makes the boss fights feel really interesting and engaging. But mobs kinda just swarm you, which renders the reactive style of gameplay this game is supposed to have completely moot unless you want to spam parries, which again, isn't very fun. To be honest, I don't really know if I have a good solution for this problem, so I'm hoping the Silver Palace developers can figure it out instead. But this complaint is pretty minor in comparison to my one big gripe about the combat system. And that gripe is that the combat isn't very responsive, meaning like half the time it felt like my inputs weren't recognized by the system. I don't know if this is due to like a lack of animation canceling or if it's because I play on controller instead of mouse and keyboard, but I just felt like half of my controls were getting ignored by the characters, you know what I mean? There's also quite a bit of hit lag and you can get stun locked really easily, and there's no good way to cross the battlefield quickly. And when the arenas are large and many characters have skills that put distance between them and the enemy, leaving you stuck wasting time having to run back towards the enemy to attack with your close range units, that kind of thing gets real frustrating real quick. I also think the ultimate animations, while really cool, are kind of too long for a style of combat that's supposed to be really fast-paced, but that opinion's a bit more subjective than the other ones, I think. Now, overall, the combat does feel better than it did in the first beta, and I'm really glad they removed the need to like aim your firearm at the enemy, because I remember that being very jarring, and now it feels a lot more seamless. But I think that just about covers all my thoughts on the combat, so I'm gonna talk real briefly on some of the other miscellaneous aspects of the game before we wrap things up. When I was playing the first beta, I was admittedly a little worried that the exploration aspect of the city would get boring pretty quick, mostly because there wasn't really a lot to do. Unfortunately, I still have this concern in the second beta because even though they've added a lot of stuff in the overworld like puzzles, collectibles, little mini quests, and combat encounters, we're still just stuck in Silvernia. And once all those puzzles are solved and the collectibles are collected and the NPCs are out of things to give us to do, we're not really gonna have a whole lot to do in the city, and I'm not sure if or when we'll be going to other areas. That said, I do get the sense that the developers are very aware of this issue, and they are experimenting with ways to solve the problem. For example, in the second beta, they've added some supplementary optional side content. These are like little mini games or management sims or alternate game modes that you can participate in even after the city has been wiped clean of exploration objectives. So you can participate in like a real estate investment management sim, or roleplay as a barista during a mini game where you take on coffee mixing challenges in exchange for rewards. I have mixed feelings about this side content, but what I do like about the implementation of these mini games is that they're baked into the world itself. So you can go to the coffee shop and talk to the people there and order things to eat and drink in addition to working there part-time as a barista. And in a lot of these mini games, you will run into characters who will canonically be interested in the types of activities these mini games represent. And I think that's pretty neat. But the most appropriate pastime for a detective is actually tracking down criminals, which you can definitely do in Silver Palace, and you have been able to do that since the very first beta. However, I also find this system to be a bit undercooked right now. And I don't know if maybe it's just that I haven't unlocked the right game mode or something yet, but it's just not very rewarding to do. And I feel like it should be a lot cooler than it is. So I would love for them to flesh out this feature a bit more and add in something more like a proper bounty system that you can access either through a seedy underground tavern or maybe just a bulletin board at the police station. Right now, it feels like the criminal hunting system is just kind of tacked on and not super purposeful. Now, new to CBT2 is the ability to invite characters to hang out in the detective's headquarters, so you can get to know them better while exchanging gifts. This feature unlocks new bits of information in their character profile as well as new voice lines and some rewards. But in order to invite these characters into your headquarters, you need to obtain them first via the gacha system. Now, I'm not going to comment on the rates or income for this system yet, not just because it's the beta, but also because I'm just not the person to explain this kind of thing. What I can tell you is that there are currently 4 types of banners, and each banner has its own unique currency. There's a limited character banner, a limited weapon banner, a standard character banner, and a standard weapon banner. Now, there are pros and cons to having unique currencies to pull on different banners with, but whether or not the system itself is considered good or free-to-play friendly will depend entirely on how the devs decide to distribute summon currency. So while I don't really like the idea of having multiple types of currency because I think it makes things a bit too complicated. I can't really comment on whether or not this is a bad thing objectively. Now, the last thing I want to touch on is the game's performance. I know we're only in the second beta and the game looks and runs way better than it did in the first beta, but the hardware requirements do seem like they're going to be pretty high. I didn't have too much trouble running the game on its default settings, and my PC is a pretty mid-range gaming machine, but even I had a couple of instances where the game ran out of memory and I had to restart it. But otherwise, the game was pretty smooth and didn't run with any frame drops. So these are my computer stats which you can compare to your own hardware to see whether or not this game will run well for you. Hopefully they continue to make performance improvements in future builds, but as it stands right now, I do think there will be a lot of people who won't be able to play the game just because their hardware is lacking, and that's a real shame. Overall though, I've had a really good time playing this game in spite of my various complaints. I do think that the game's greatest strength is its story though, which I consider to be a really good thing given how important the quality of writing is for a mystery genre game, but I do think the combat system still needs some more refinement and the general gameplay needs a bit more depth or purpose to it before the game goes from being good to being great. More robust gameplay systems may not be necessary for the launch of the game, but I do think the need for it will become more and more apparent as time goes on and people start clearing out all of their exploration objectives and quest markers. Now, don't get me wrong, this game is beautiful with an aesthetic that I rarely see outside of series like Final Fantasy or, more to my taste, Baten Kaitos, but there's only so long I can stare at a beautiful landscape before I want to do something else. But yeah, overall a really solid beta for a very promising game. Now, it does seem like there will be a third beta, so we still do have quite a lot of time to watch the developers cook. And if this review has piqued your interest, you can watch my full playthrough of the second beta on my channel. I'll leave a link in the description box, alongside a link to pre-register for the game. I think if you're someone who likes good character-driven stories and appreciate a decent mystery, then this might be the game for you. But if you're someone who tends to skip dialogue in the story, I'm not really sure you'll like this game very much. I could be wrong about that, since the combat is interesting and has a ton of potential, but just be forewarned that if story isn't your thing, you're signing up for a lot of story. But story is my thing, so I'm pretty happy. And that concludes my review of Silver Palace's second closed beta test. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will catch you next time. Bye-bye!